Joining me on the program now from the Hope Project, Dave Mann. Dave, kia ora. Thanks for your time.
Hey, kia ora, Andrew.
The origin of the welfare state. Now, Dave, because I'm talking to you about this, and you and I have had many conversations, I suspect that that Christianity, that faith inspired this. This was a part of the journey for us here in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely it was. Christianity and its values sat behind the development of the welfare state. But I think to understand how Christian charity became state charity sort of really does require some of the history. And that's where I think it's worth us knowing because it helps us understand who we are as a nation.
Now, there were various difficult financial times in New Zealand's history, but I suppose the recognition that in tough times people get left behind, be it the elderly or various other categories of people, all came to a head in the Great Depression, I understand, and what was the first Labour government?
Yeah, that's right. We had a small depression in the late 1800s. And the poverty of people then is, today no one's got anything to complain about
Yeah.
at all. It was a completely different scale through all of history compared to what we have today. I would say that poverty continued through the early 2000s and 1900s and the
Yep.
1910s. You've got World War One sitting inside that period of time. That didn't really help us. But the Great Depression really kicks in 1929 through
Yep.
to 1939. And the problem of that depression is actually not just how great it was, but it's how long it went for. To get through it, the government, first of all, had to reduce people's incomes everywhere to reduce the expenditure. They had to take the pension that did exist by that point and they had to lower it. They completely cancelled nearly all public works except for jobs that they kept going for. They were called work camps. So, for example, you might build a new dam and people might be digging it out practically with shovels back then, but they were trying to provide work for people. But the problem with that was that if a man is looking for work and he can't support his family, he grabs a shovel in Dunedin and walks off to one of the South Island dams
Yeah.
where it's being built, digging on people's farms along the way in exchange for some food each night that he sleeps. He's a long way from his family. And with the depression continuing for over a decade, you've got men who are away from their families and kind of a breakdown of society caused by just this crippling poverty. Even in schools, they stopped employing women as teachers if they were married.
Wow.
The reasoning being that a woman might have a husband who might be working. Why would you allow two incomes inside one house when people are desperate for any income whatsoever? So yeah, it was that just crippling poverty that began to change our attitudes, where the churches have provided our charity as a nation, but the churches just couldn't sustain that extent of poverty.
Faith was something which inspired political change, and as we've said beforehand, faith is often the inspiration behind significant movements, be it the abolition of slavery or even the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. What was the faith inspiration behind the movement that led to the welfare state, Dave?
Yeah, I kind of see at least 4 or 5 stories that are needed here to paint the picture. But to give one of the first of those, William Booth and the Salvation Army were highly engaged in what we could call evangelical or Christian activism.
Yeah.
And they were really trying to deal with poverty and injustice and social need in an uncaring society. The world was like that everywhere. Just to give the Great Awakening, you'd heard of the John and Charles Wesley, and so that was sort of earlier on. Then 50 years later, you've got the Clapham sect and all of their humanitarian effort, and then another 50 years later, you've got the Salvation Army. And having given his life to charity, setting up, you've got food banks and soup kitchens and hostels and work with prisoners. William and Catherine Booth are getting older. Catherine's on her deathbed, and William realizes we still haven't achieved the dream.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book called In Darkest England and the Way Out. They sold 115,000 copies in the first week of sales, and it came out only 2 weeks after his wife died. And in it, he presented a picture for what Christian charity across an entire civilization could look like. And he really set a template that I think generated discussion that eventuated in all these other kinds of initiatives that eventually got picked up by the state. For example, they started the first labour exchange the first ever one created, in which you try to connect workers with people looking for workers. 69,000 people placed in employment in the first 7 years. They started a missing persons bureau in London. 9,000 people a year used to go missing. And so they helped to begin to solve these problems. A legal aid service for the poor who couldn't afford a lawyer. A poor man's bank to help people get training or to start a business. Precursors to the modern kindergarten. Another area they engaged in was around labour and the abuse of labour. Early on in his Christian ministry, William Booth had come across families with children working from as young as 14 hours per day, 6 days per week.
Wow.
And it was just abusive.
Yeah.
One of the stories was the match factories. The match factories only employed 8-year-olds and older, but they were employed 16 hours per day, 6 days per week,
Yep.
with no breaks, and you'd be hit with a stick if you fell asleep, which naturally they did,
Yeah.
with toxic chemicals that would make their bones glow and then would corrode them. And so the children and women were dying terrible deaths, 4,000 workers in a factory. And again, so William Booth started to engage with what sort of labour laws are going to be needed and to speak into this. What would a society look like if the church could take care of all care, but the church couldn't? And that's where it began to become a state intervention when the Depression got worse.
So William Booth focusing in on labour laws and some of the abuses of working conditions led to some of the ethics behind the founding of the Labour Party. Is that how the whakapapa of that connects, Dave?
Yeah, it jumps on quite a long way. There's quite a bit of history between those 2 points, but as a draft picture, that is the direction that it goes. It's the secularizing of the Christian value. And I mean, if I give an illustration of it, Reverend Rutherford Waddell, a Dunedin Presbyterian pastor, and he looks at some of the abuses in labour. Girls working from 8:30 a.m. to 11 p.m. to earn 3 shillings and sixpence, working in their homes, sewing.
Wow.
So it was called sweating because they were sweating hard, working long hours for almost no money. So he preached a sermon, and sermons could make newspaper headlines back then. Its name was, I can't find the name of the sermon in front of me, but it was a cutting name,
Yeah.
and it made the newspaper headlines, but it raised the issue. And then the government became aware of it, and he got all of his congregants to begin to voice the injustice to everyone that they could, and it pushed the government to do a Royal Commission of Inquiry
Wow.
into worker relations, which resulted in that inquiry in 1889, which resulted in the Factories Act in 1891. But if we look at the process, you've got a Presbyterian minister in newspaper headlines addressing labour injustices in New Zealand where the wealthy are abusing workers,
Yeah.
which then goes to government. But then in a Christian society embodied in Christian values, which we were, they say, well, shouldn't the government take responsibility, and laws of government begin to become the solution? So by that process, the appetite grew for a government intervention to bring the Christian care to everybody.
And hey, as you say, predominantly a Christian society, but and hey, great things done with the welfare state as set up predominantly in response to the Depression by the first Labour government. As you were indicating beforehand, though, that makes sense in a Christian worldview. But when we try and secularize our motivations here, perhaps, the wheels start to fall off, Dave.
Yeah, and that becomes the challenge. And I mean, we don't have space here to go fully into it, but one principle would be that work should always be connected to money, and money should be connected to work. So if you give money for free, you'll undermine human motivation to work, you'll create an underclass, and people will learn to abuse the system. So the work camps were great as a temporary measure for the poverty of the Depression. But when men are away from their wives and their children for extended periods because the Depression keeps going and going and going, even the churches began to support the idea that maybe we give money for free.
Yeah.
The problem is that what was created for an emergency scenario by that Labour government, and it was a brilliant effort, the Act, I think, passed in 1938. They got into Parliament in 1935. It was a brilliant move of charity. The problem is that what should have been an emergency measure became our new normal. In which case, if you're going to give me money for free for this, well, what about money for those people over there for that?
Yeah.
And what about money over here for this? And it's become this never-ending ask, and then abused really by our perception that this is our right. If I'm unemployed, it's my right to receive money. And now we've got a government that we expect to fork out for us. How does an economy ever support that? So the welfare state is brilliant. We have it as good as anyone ever has in history. But if we remove certain Christian values from it, we actually begin to sign its death certificate.
Yeah.
And I suspect that this is the tussle that our nation is within.
I mean, a very different situation now from back in the 1930s and certainly at the turn of the previous century when we were predominantly a Christian nation. Any way back on this, Dave? Yes, we can learn some lessons from the origin of the welfare state. But, I mean, as you say, this has become a little bit of an ideological football between various political parties. It's very much a political rather than a philanthropic motivation behind it. What do you think the church has to say in this space? How can we use our influence positively?
I mean, the church is always going to have to fill the gaps of care. And so we're always going to have a role to play. A state-run system is going to be inefficient, and if it doesn't have Christ in it, I believe it will eventually fall over.
Yeah.
So the church's role is only going to increase into the future, and people in need can reach out to God, and God will reach back to them. And so that remains true. But I think politically we need to understand that both the left and the right will fail if they don't have Christ in them. The left will have an ever bigger government to help the people, which will create a burden of debt we can't sustain. The right will stand for the freedoms of the individual, however, to the point where if people aren't also charitable, you've got a wealthy and the poor becoming separated.
Yeah.
On both sides of the spectrum, the wealthy and the poor are separated. On both sides, the government or the wealthy end up with power. The only way out of this is if we again recognise Christ. Individual freedoms and responsibilities to act charitably. And Christianity uniquely brings that. So our voice is important. A return to Christianity is important. It can redeem, I think, a welfare system and a political system that has fantastic foundations, but its only future is through the sustaining of the values that it was originally built upon.
Dave, very well said. Some interesting food for thought on that. Thank you so much for the work that you do in this space, for the wisdom that you bring to this program. Thanks for joining us once again.
Cool. Cheers, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.